So I'm looking behind you and watching a torrential downpour and thinking, maybe I should have mentioned Noah and the flood instead of the 7 days of creation. So I want to share a final reading with you before I share a few thoughts with you about rest. This reading is an excerpt from a book written by a minister named Gary Shockley. The book was called The Meandering Way, and it's a book that he wrote for fellow ministers to encourage them to rest and slow down. There's a whole cottage industry of books like that. I like this one in particular. I probably bought it at a time when I was feeling tired. And but I really liked it. I don't think it's really just for ministers. I think it's for everybody. So here's just a few paragraphs from it that I especially like. He says, "I am becoming more and more aware of the pace at which I live my life. Lately, I've especially noticed how I react during the workday when someone at my office interrupts me as I'm rushing from one meeting to another. As they begin to speak, I find myself standing there as if I'm listening when my mind is actually somewhere else. Sometimes I even have one foot, I'm acting it out right now, pointing in the direction I intend to rush to next, ready to bolt at the first opportunity I find. How did I get this way? When did my life embrace drivenness as a virtue? Unfortunately, being driven from one task, one goal, one success to another defines modern life. Think about it. How often during your day are you driven to accomplish, driven to succeed, driven to perfection, driven to be in control, driven to please others? As I have gotten older, I have come to realize that life is far too stressful to be compounding it with the anxiety, the pressure, and the pain of drivenness. I am slowly finding a better way, what I call the meandering way. To meander is to take a winding course. Meandering is like taking a casual stroll on the beach, stopping to look for shells, smelling the misty fragrance of the salt air. Meandering is like taking a leisurely walk through a forest and simply following the contours of a crooked, mossy path. Unlike drivenness, which means getting somewhere fast or accomplishing our goals the quickest way possible, meandering slows us down and helps us appreciate the here and now, where we are on our journeys, what we are experiencing, and who might be journeying beside us." Gary Shockley, The Meandering Way. Well, it's so good to be with you all. This is my third Sunday here in the pulpit. My third week here at the church. I've enjoyed every minute of it. You guys are a blast. So I'm having fun. I just want to say that. So welcome to this day of shirking, of meandering, of simply being present and resting rather than doing and doing and then doing even more. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but let me just pause to make a comment about this decision I made to offer a sermon topic in the auction. Now, I just want to say that I love a challenge, and I welcome any and all topics, although I do have some pretty glaring weaknesses in my preaching repertoire. For example, my scientific and technical know-how is slim to none. So for those of you scientific types out there, if you decide to have a laugh by asking me to, I don't know, explain Einstein's theory of relativity, I will get the last laugh because I will just stand here and say, E equals mc squared. Amen. Now, whenever I preach on this topic of rest and of being rather than always doing, I invariably start with a confession. You see, this is one of those sermons where I am preaching as much, if not more, to myself as I am to all of you. Too often, much like Gary Shockley, my life can get taken over by the need to cross things off my to-do list and by listening to a voice urging me to work harder and shirk no more. And by the way, that voice, 99 times out of 100, is not a member of the congregation I serve. It's this voice in my head that seems to want to always shout at me to do more and to rest less. It's almost always that voice. The voice, I'm the annoying one that's saying, stop shirking, work harder. I really want to get that person to be quiet a lot more. Most of the things that I think are so urgent that I have to get them done right now usually aren't as urgent as I like to make them out to be, and not as important as taking time to breathe and to rest. But there's one exception to that. There is one thing on my to-do list, and I hope on the to-do list of everyone in this room, that needs to be done now, today, and every day. And that one thing is paying attention to and doing our part to heal this broken world of ours. A world that feels to me as if it is moving faster and faster in the wrong direction. There's so much that needs to be done and done now. Our climate is getting hotter, and many parts of our planet this summer are literally on fire. Democracy and democratic institutions are being undermined and corrupted in this country and across the world. People from marginalized communities and identities are being oppressed, harassed, and denied their rights on a daily basis. How can I, a person of enormous privilege, resources, and comfort, stand before you and preach about how much rest and renewal I need when so many in our world are hurting and filled with uncertainty and anxiety about the future? I wrestle with this question a lot, and I'm not sure that I've really come up with a good answer, except to say this. One thing I do know is that a broken world will never be healed if most of its people are exhausted and burned out. A few years ago, I read a really interesting article about I'll use the word, the epidemic of exhaustion in our world. And this article pointed out how much the voices of hate and oppression depend on people who are tired and worn down to the point that they become numb to all the hurtful and harmful things going on. I know there are days when I just can't listen to one more story on the news or think about how harsh and toxic the world is becoming. And this complacency and unwillingness to face reality happens most often when I am overtired, emotionally drained, and yes, feeling burned out. It is only the rested heart and the nourished soul that can mend a broken world. So let's talk for a couple minutes about rest. And I want to begin by asking the same question I think that Gary Shockley posed, which is, why are so many so tired and so burned out so much of the time? Why do busyness and overwork so often take over our lives? Well, much of the answer, I think, stems from the culture, the society, and the economy that we live in. A culture that puts a premium on not simply doing and working hard, but on always striving to do more. Economic necessity and a torn safety net compel so many folks to work 2, 3, and even 4 jobs. Think for a moment about how much the pandemic overworked and overtaxed our healthcare workers and the essential workers who are almost always earning scandalously low wages. Furthermore, I think our American U.S. culture celebrates still the dedication and work ethic of those who put in 18-hour work days and who work 60, 70, or even more hours during the week. And while advances in technology and communication add convenience to our lives, they can also make it harder, if not impossible, to just disconnect for a while, to turn off the cell phones and not to be driven by emails, texts, and social media, and to simply take time for calm and quiet. Now, yesterday, as I was thinking about this sermon, my wife Carol mentioned to me an article that she had read about this new phenomenon. I don't know if you've heard about this either, called quiet quitting. So apparently what this is younger generations who are coming into the workforce are kind of rebelling against this ethic of, hey, you want to get ahead, you need to be here not just 40 hours, but 50, 60, 70, by simply saying, I'm going to do the basics of what needs to be done and not a thing more. So it's not quitting, it's quietly rebelling against this ethic which is harming and has harmed generations of people in this country and undoubtedly in other parts of the world. I'm going to keep an eye on this, and I may tell you more about it at another time. Now, in some ways, I think, other than those who are quiet quitting, we are so driven by the rush to do and do more that we barely notice how little time we take or are given simply for being rather than always doing. Too often our lives are a blur and a race to the next job and the next task that needs to be done. That is, of course, until we are subjected to so much physical and emotional strain that our health, both physical and mental, suffer, and our families and relationships are negatively impacted. And even when we are forced to slow down long enough to heal, we do it so that we can recharge our batteries and recover sufficient energy to throw ourselves back into an economy, a workforce, a society of long hours, and a race that never ends. And I think something else happens to us when we are caught in that hamster wheel of doing and more doing. I know when I find myself overtired, I'm no longer able to really listen, to express as I normally would the love and care I feel for others and the world around me, and to experience those things that bring peace and serenity to my life. So when I'm in that frantic drivenness mode, I don't take time to listen to the birds sing on a beautiful summer morning. I don't slow down long enough to gaze at a magnificent sunset or night sky. I simply keep going and keep doing, barely noticing the simple blessings that make my life meaningful and my spirit whole. And that's why it's so important to follow, as best we can, a different ethic and a different path. The Shirk ethic and the meandering way. I have to say that word meandering, I just love the sound of it. The sound meanders. I don't know, does that make sense? Probably doesn't. But it just, when I say meandering, I don't know, I start to slow down a little bit. I think meandering, rather than driving us from one task to another, meandering allows us to slow down, to wander, to drift, and simply to be. Like a slow-moving stream, that's a nice picture of a kind of slow-moving stream. Meandering allows us to follow a path that is winding and indirect, a path that enables us to experience so much of what we miss when we are in the grips of stress and anxiety. When we follow the meandering way, our lives truly become about the beauty and blessings of the journey, rather than about the countless destinations and goals we are so often pursuing. And when I'm meandering, something else, something wonderful begins to happen to my spirit, to my soul. I become so much more aware, so much more at peace, and so much more grateful for the world around me. I feel, I experience, I embody the beauty and blessings of life. And there's a word that I want to spend a minute talking about that I think describes this kind of spiritual rest. And that word is Sabbath. Now, I know the word Sabbath can conjure up images of, long hours spent in a place of worship, listening to someone like, me, drone on about some arcane theological subject or text. But Sabbath isn't really about theology or sermons or sacred texts, and it's not even about attending a service at a congregation or temple or mosque. Rather, Sabbath is about rest and the spiritual nourishment that rest can provide us. Sabbath is, as a wonderful writer Wayne Muller, who wrote a great book a few years ago about this, he defines Sabbath as a way of being in time, where we remember who we are, remember what we know, and taste the gifts of eternity and spirit. Ooh, that's good writing. It is this understanding of rest and Sabbath that I want to lift up, not rest as simply a means for recharging so we can even do more and work even harder, but rather rest as a sacred act and a spiritual practice that enables us, that creates space in our heart and in our spirit to appreciate the joys and blessings of life. And when it comes to Sabbath, I think that Unitarian Universalism, all religious traditions, could learn so much from Judaism and the Jewish tradition. Judaism has so much to teach us about the importance of Sabbath in our lives. You may be aware that Shabbat, or Shabbos, begins at sundown every Friday and ends at sundown on Saturday. Shabbat is, more than anything else, a time of rest, of family, of community, of celebration, of spiritual renewal. It's not a time to work. You don't take that 24 hours to get those things done you didn't finish on before Friday at sundown. It's not a time to get caught up to cross a few more things off your to-do list. That's why there are rules about Shabbat in the Jewish tradition that forbid work in all of its many forms. Shabbat is truly a time to live in a different way and at a different pace. And my absolute favorite all-time description of the meaning and purpose of Sabbath comes from one of the great Jewish thinkers of all time, but certainly of the last 100 years, Abraham Joshua Heschel. I don't know if that name is familiar to any of you, who wrote, I think, and this is, by the way, you all know I'm a book person, and one thing I do during sermons from time to time is recommend a book and put the picture of it on the screen, and I'm about to do that. So Rabbi Heschel, who is passed away decades ago, he wrote what I think is one of the great spiritual classics of all time. And you can read it in a couple of hours. It's about 90 pages. It's called The Sabbath. There's the cover of the latest edition. And it is wonderful. It is so wonderful. And here's a reason why. Listen to this language. Rabbi Heschel was a refugee. I could talk about him all afternoon. So Rabbi Heschel was a refugee from Poland and Germany in the 1930s, came to this country barely speaking a word of English, was incredibly gifted with languages, and wrote all of his work after he got to this country in English. And it is some of the most beautiful English I have ever read. I don't know how this man did it, but listen to how he describes Sabbath. He says, Sabbath is an opportunity to build a cathedral in time, an opportunity to live on an island of stillness, and an opportunity to be reminded that for all of the hustle and bustle of work and doing, we dwell in a world, as he so beautifully puts it, a world that is adjacent to eternity. A world that is adjacent to eternity. Before closing, I want to say a word about rest and Sabbath and this spiritual community, the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Charlottesville. More than anything else, when you come through these doors or join us on Zoom, I want you to find Sabbath and rest. In Unitarian Universalism, we often find ourselves busy, and this congregation is no exception. We have many programs and projects, meetings, and so forth. And don't get me wrong, those programs and projects are wonderful, and they are essential in a religion that prides itself on deeds rather than creeds. But as we do all that wonderful work, and as we engage in all that wonderful ministry, the ministry of this beloved community, we must always do that work from a place of rest, from a place of being, and from a place of Sabbath. A place where we are always finding ways to enrich our spirits and to spend time together in community on islands of stillness. So as you find yourselves once again in the world of work and doing, I hope, and my prayer for you is that you would give yourselves the gift of Sabbath and make time for those islands of stillness and for that taste of eternity. Take time just for being and not always for doing. Even if you are in the middle of an incredibly busy day, a day that is making you feel overwhelmed and at your wits' end, find a moment, maybe just a minute, to remind yourself to breathe, to pause. Let your spirit meander. For when we give ourselves that blessed and sacred gift of rest, we do indeed create, even if it's just for a moment, a cathedral in time, a place where we can share and experience beauty and blessing and the miracle of being alive and of being part of this magnificent creation, a creation that's hurting, but that still and always will fill my heart with awe and wonder and take my breath away. Give yourself the gift of just resting so that you can be one and at peace with this magnificent creation that is our home. Thank you so much for listening and for resting with me this morning. Blessed be.